The stagecoach lurched to a violent halt as 6 masked riders surrounded it on the dusty trail outside Lincoln, Nebraska, their rifles aimed steadily at the driver and his lone passenger inside. It was September 1876, and the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Great Plains as Tabitha Morgan pressed herself against the worn leather seat, her heart hammering against her rib cage. She had been traveling for 3 days to meet her intended husband, a wealthy rancher named William Frost, who had courted her through letters for the past year. Now, as rough hands yanked open the stagecoach door and a grizzled bandit with tobacco-stained teeth leered at her, she wondered if she would ever reach her destination. "Well, well, what do we have here?" the bandit drawled, his eyes raking over her traveling dress of deep green wool. "Looks like we got ourselves a real lady." The driver, an elderly man named Chester, raised his hand slowly. "Please, gentlemen, she has nothing of value. Just let us pass." The leader of the bandits, a tall man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, dismounted and strode toward the coach. "Nothing of value? I beg to differ. This pretty thing looks like she is worth quite a bit to someone." He grabbed Tabitha's wrist and pulled her roughly from the coach. She stumbled, her boots hitting the hard-packed earth, and tried to wrench her arm free. "Let me go!" Her voice came out stronger than she felt. "My fiancé will not pay you a single penny for me. We have never even met in person." The scarred bandit laughed, a harsh sound that sent chills down her spine despite the heat. "Then I guess we will find out how much a man values his mail-order bride, will we not?" He turned to one of his men. "Tie up the driver and take the horses. We are bringing the lady with us." Tabitha fought as they bound her wrists with rough rope, but the bandits were too strong. They placed her on a horse in front of one of the riders, and the group set off at a gallop toward the distant mountains that rose like jagged teeth against the horizon. The stagecoach driver was left tied to a tree, his frantic shouts fading behind them as they rode. Terror coursed through her veins, but beneath it was a stubborn determination. She was 23 years old, had survived the death of both her parents, had made the journey west alone, and she would not let these criminals be her end. They rode for hours, the landscape gradually changing from flat prairie to rolling hills dotted with scrub pine and juniper. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, the bandits led her into a narrow canyon where a ramshackle cabin sat nestled against the rock face. Smoke rose from a crude chimney, and Tabitha could see another man emerge from the doorway as they approached. "Got ourselves a prize, boys?" this new man called out, wiping his hands on his dirty trousers. "Sure did, Pike," the scarred leader responded, dismounting and hauling Tabitha down from the horse. Her legs nearly buckled after the long ride, but she forced herself to stand straight. "Send word to William Frost at the Double F Ranch. Tell him we want $10,000 for his bride, or he can find himself another woman." $10,000. The sum was staggering. Tabitha knew her fiancé was wealthy, but she had no idea if he would actually pay such a ransom for a woman he had never met. Their correspondence had been cordial, even warm. But was that enough to warrant such an expenditure? Doubt gnawed at her as the bandits pushed her inside the cabin. The interior was as rough as the exterior, with a dirt floor, a crude table, and a single cot in the corner. The air smelled of unwashed bodies, whiskey, and old smoke. The scarred leader, who the others called Garrett, shoved her toward the cot. "Make yourself comfortable, princess. You're going to be here a while." "How long?" she asked, hating the tremor in her voice. Garrett shrugged. "Depends on how fast your man can scrape together the money. Could be 3 days, could be 3 weeks. He grinned, showing yellowed teeth. "Best hope it is sooner rather than later. My boys here, they get restless." The implication made her stomach turn, but she lifted her chin. "If you harm me, you will never see a penny of that ransom." "Smart girl," Garrett said, his grin fading. "Lucky for you, I am a businessman first. You stay put, stay quiet, and nobody touches you. Try to run, and all bets are off." He turned to the others. "Pike, you and Silas take first watch. Rest of you get some grub going. I am hungry enough to eat a horse." The night that followed was the longest of Tabitha's life. The bandits ate a meager dinner of hardtack and beans, offering her a small portion that she forced herself to swallow despite her churning stomach. They talked among themselves, their conversation crude and punctuated with bursts of harsh laughter. She sat on the cot, her bound wrists aching, and tried to think of a way out. The canyon was isolated, surrounded by steep rock walls. Even if she could slip away, where would she go? She had no horse, no supplies, and no idea which direction led back to Lincoln. As the bandits eventually settled down to sleep, taking turns keeping watch at the door, Tabitha lay on the cot and stared at the rough wooden ceiling. She thought of her parents, dead these past 5 years from fever. She thought of the small house in Ohio she had sold to fund her journey west. She thought of William Frost's letters, carefully written and full of promises of a good life on his ranch. Would he pay the ransom? Or would he cut his losses and find another bride? The days blurred together. On the second day, Pike rode off to deliver the ransom demand. Garrett grew increasingly irritable as time passed, pacing the cabin like a caged animal. The other bandits, Silas, Marcus, and 2 brothers named Jake and Tom, occupied themselves with cards and whiskey. Tabitha remained on the cot, speaking only when necessary, watching and waiting for any opportunity that might present itself. It was on the 4th night that everything changed. She had been dozing fitfully, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion despite her fear, when a strange sound woke her. It was so faint she thought at first she had imagined it a soft scraping, like leather on wood. She opened her eyes in the darkness, her heart rate accelerating. The bandits were all asleep except for Marcus, who sat slumped against the doorframe, his chin on his chest. The scraping sound came again, and Tabitha realized with a jolt that it was coming from the back wall of the cabin. Before she could process what was happening, a section of the wooden wall moved inward, creating a narrow gap. A figure slipped through, moving with such fluid silence that it seemed impossible for someone so large. In the dim light from the dying fire, Tabitha could make out broad shoulders, long dark hair tied back, and a face that was all sharp angles and hard planes. The man moved like a ghost, crossing the cabin in 3 strides to where she lay frozen on the cot. He pressed a finger to his lips, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that took her breath away. Those eyes were a startling pale blue, almost silver in the darkness, and they held a warning and a promise all at once. Without a word, he reached down and with a quick movement of a wickedly sharp knife, cut through the ropes binding her wrists. His hands, calloused and strong, pulled her to her feet with surprising gentleness. Tabitha's mind reeled. Who was this man? Was he with the bandits, or was he her rescue? Before she could ask, he bent and in one smooth motion lifted her into his arms. She stifled a gasp at the sudden movement, at the feeling of solid muscle beneath his buckskin shirt. He was easily 6 feet 4 inches of pure strength, his arms holding her as if she weighed nothing at all. He carried her toward the gap in the wall, moving with that same uncanny silence. Marcus stirred at the doorway and Tabitha's heart stopped, but the bandit only shifted position and resumed his fitful sleep. The mysterious mountain man slipped through the opening with her in his arms, and then they were outside in the cool night air. He did not pause or slow. Still carrying her, he moved along the base of the canyon wall, keeping to the deepest shadows. Tabitha could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his body, and she found herself clinging to his shirt, her fingers gripping the soft leather. They reached the mouth of the canyon, and she saw a large bay stallion waiting in the darkness, ground tied and utterly still. The man placed her on the horse, then swung up behind her in one fluid motion. His arms came around her to grasp the reins, and then they were moving, the horse's hooves muffled by the sandy ground as they rode away from the bandit camp. He urged the stallion into a steady lope, angling away from the canyon and into the broken terrain beyond. They rode for what felt like hours, the landscape passing in a blur of silver moonlight and deep shadow. Tabitha's body was pressed against the stranger's chest, and she could feel the steady beat of his heart, the solid strength of him. Questions tumbled through her mind, but something told her to wait, to stay silent until they were truly safe. Finally, as the sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn, he slowed the horse and guided it into a narrow draw thick with cottonwoods. A small creek burbled over smooth stones, and the air was suddenly cooler, fresher. He dismounted, then reached up to lift her down. Her legs were shaky, and she stumbled. His hands steadied her, strong and sure. "Can you walk?" His voice was deep, roughened by what sounded like years of disuse, but there was a gentleness to it that surprised her. "Yes," she managed, her own voice hoarse. "Who are you?" How did you find me? Name is Ethan Carver, he said, releasing her and stepping back. In the growing light, she could see him more clearly now. He was perhaps 30 years old, with long, dark hair that fell past his shoulders, a thick beard covering the lower half of his face, and those striking pale blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. He wore buckskin trousers and shirt, well-made moccasins, and had a large knife sheathed at his belt along with a rifle slung across his back. Muscles corded his arms and shoulders, visible even through the leather. He looked like something out of a legend, a true mountain man straight from the wilderness tales she had read as a girl. I heard tell from a trapper that Garrett's gang had taken a woman, he continued, kneeling by the creek to fill a canteen. Figured it was my business to intervene. Your business? Tabitha asked, sinking down onto a smooth rock near the water. Her wrists were raw from the ropes, and she dipped them into the cool creek, wincing at the sting. Why would my kidnapping be your business? Ethan was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. Garrett and his men, they have been terrorizing this territory for 2 years. Shot my brother last winter when he stumbled onto their camp while hunting, left him to die in the snow. His jaw tightened, visible even through the beard. Been tracking them ever since, waiting for the right moment. I am so sorry, Tabitha said softly, understanding flooding through her. This was not just a rescue. It was vengeance, justice, or perhaps both. Your brother, did he... Survived, Ethan said, his expression softening slightly. Barely. Took all winter nursing him back to health, but he lives down in Denver now, cannot work like he used to. Took a bullet to the leg. Tabitha nodded, absorbing this information. So you came for me to get to them? Came for you because no woman deserves what Garrett has planned, Ethan said bluntly. The ransom was just the start. Once he got his money, he would have killed you to eliminate the witness. That is how he operates. A shudder ran through her. She had suspected as much, but hearing it stated so plainly made it real. Thank you, she whispered. You saved my life, Mr. Carver. Ethan, he corrected, meeting her eyes again. Something passed between them in that moment, some unspoken connection that made Tabitha's breath catch. Just Ethan. Tabitha Morgan, she offered, managing a small smile despite everything. Just Tabitha. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly beneath the beard, the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. Well, just Tabitha. We need to put more distance between us and that canyon before they realize you are gone. Can you ride? Yes, I can ride, she assured him, standing on legs that were steadier now. Where are we going? Got a cabin about 15 miles north of here, up in the hills, Ethan said, moving to check his horse's saddle. Hidden, defensible. We can hole up there until Garrett gives up the search, or I can get you safely back to Lincoln. Lincoln, Tabitha repeated, thinking of William Frost, of the marriage she was supposed to be entering. It felt like another lifetime now, those carefully worded letters and polite promises. Yes, I suppose I should return there. Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Your man, this William Frost, was he going to pay the ransom? I honestly do not know, Tabitha admitted. We have never met. Our entire courtship was through correspondence. Something flickered in Ethan's eyes, but he said nothing, simply nodded and swung back up onto his horse. He offered her his hand, and she took it, allowing him to pull her up behind him this time. She wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling again that solid strength, and tried not to think about how safe she felt in his presence. They rode through the morning, following game trails and creek beds, always moving north and west into increasingly rugged terrain. Ethan proved to be a man of few words, but Tabitha found she did not mind the silence. There was something peaceful about it, about the rhythmic gait of the horse, the whisper of wind through the pines, the distant call of a hawk. By midday, they stopped to rest the horse and eat some jerky and hardtack from Ethan's saddlebags. They sat in the shade of a massive boulder, and Tabitha found herself studying her rescuer. His hands, she noticed, were scarred from hard work and harder living. There was a stillness about him, a self-sufficiency that spoke of years spent alone in the wilderness. How long have you been living in the mountains? She asked, breaking the comfortable quiet. 8 years, give or take, Ethan replied, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of jerky. Came out here after the war. Could not stomach going back to Missouri, to farming and civilization after what I had seen. The war, Tabitha said softly. That would have made him a young man during the conflict, probably no more than 18 or 19 when it started. I lost friends in the war. It was a terrible time. Yes, it was, Ethan agreed, his gaze distant. Learned a lot about killing, not much about living. The mountains, they gave me that back. Taught me how to be human again. There was such raw honesty in his words that Tabitha felt something shift in her chest. This man, this rough mountain man who had carried her out of captivity in the dead of night, was more complex than he first appeared. Do you ever get lonely? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip. Sometimes, he admitted, but alone is better than being with the wrong people. They continued riding as the afternoon wore on, the terrain growing steeper and more wooded. Tabitha's body ached from the long hours on horseback, but she did not complain. Ethan seemed to sense her discomfort, though, and made more frequent stops to let her stretch her legs and drink from the canteen. As evening approached, they climbed a steep, narrow trail that wound through a dense stand of pines. Tabitha could hear water rushing somewhere nearby, and the air smelled of evergreen and earth. Suddenly, the trees opened up, and she saw it a small log cabin tucked against a rocky hillside, with a lean-to stable beside it and a clear, fast-flowing stream just beyond. It was beautiful in its simplicity, perfectly situated to overlook the valley below while remaining hidden from casual observation. "Home," Ethan said simply, dismounting and helping her down. "Not much, but it is mine." "It is wonderful," Tabitha said honestly, looking around at the small clearing. There was a garden plot near the cabin, though it had clearly been neglected recently, and she could see traps and furs hanging from the lean-to. A stone fire pit sat in front of the cabin, surrounded by smooth rocks for sitting. Ethan led his horse to the lean-to, unsaddling and rubbing the animal down with practiced efficiency. Tabitha stood uncertainly by the cabin door until he finished and came to unlock it. The interior was dim but clean, with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and chairs, a bed in one corner covered with furs, and shelves lined with supplies and books. Books she had not expected that. "You read?" she asked, surprised. "One of the few pleasures I allow myself," Ethan said, moving to build a fire in the hearth. "Winter nights are long in the mountains." Tabitha moved closer to the shelves, reading the titles by the fading light from the window. Shakespeare, Thoreau, Melville, even some Austen. "These are wonderful," she murmured, pulling down a worn copy of Walden. "I love to read." "Then you are welcome to any of them," Ethan said, glancing over his shoulder as he coaxed the fire to life. "I will sleep in the lean-to with the horse. You take the cabin." "No," Tabitha protested immediately. "This is your home. I cannot displace you." "You are a lady," Ethan said firmly, straightening as flames began to lick at the kindling. "You will sleep in a proper bed, not in a stable. I have done it before, and I will be fine." They stared at each other for a long moment, and Tabitha could see there would be no arguing with him. "At least let me make dinner," she finally said. "You have done so much for me. Let me do something in return." Ethan considered this, then nodded. "There's venison in the cold box outside, buried in the stream. Potatoes and onions in the bin there. I will fetch water." They worked together in companionable silence, Tabitha preparing a simple but hearty stew, while Ethan tended to other chores around the cabin. She found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking, noticing the way he moved with such economy and purpose, the strength in his shoulders as he brought in firewood, the gentle way he handled things despite his obvious power. When the stew was ready, they sat at the table and ate, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the log walls. It was the first real meal Tabitha had enjoyed since her capture, and she found herself eating with genuine appetite. "This is excellent," Ethan said, sounding almost surprised. "You are a fine cook." "Thank you," Tabitha replied, pleased by the compliment. "My mother taught me. She said a woman should be able to feed her family well, no matter the circumstances." "Wise woman," Ethan said, sopping up the last of his stew with a piece of bread. As they cleaned up together, washing dishes in a bucket of warm water, Tabitha found herself relaxing in a way she had not since before her parents died. There was something deeply comforting about the simple domesticity of the moment, about the quiet presence of this strong, gentle man beside her. "Tell me about yourself," Ethan said suddenly, surprising her. "What made you decide to become a mail-order bride?" Tabitha paused, her hands stilling in the dishwater. After my parents died, I had no family left in Ohio, she said slowly. I tried to make it on my own, working as a seamstress, but it was never enough. When I saw William Frost's advertisement for a wife, it seemed like a chance for a new start, a real home again. And now? Ethan asked quietly. Now, Tabitha said, turning to look at him, I'm not so certain what I want anymore. Their eyes met, and that strange electric connection sparked between them again. Ethan was the first to look away, clearing his throat. You should get some rest, he said gruffly. You've been through a lot these past few days. Tabitha nodded, though she found she did not want the evening to end. Thank you again, Ethan, for everything. No thanks needed, he replied, already moving toward the door. I did what any decent man would do. But Tabitha knew that was not true. Ethan Carver was not just any man, decent or otherwise. He was something special, something rare, and she found herself thinking about him long after he had gone to sleep in the lean-to, and she had settled into his bed, surrounded by the scent of pine and leather that clung to the furs. The next few days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Ethan hunted and tended to necessary repairs around the cabin, while Tabitha cooked, mended his clothes, and worked on bringing the neglected garden back to some semblance of order. They talked in the evenings, long conversations that ranged from books they had read to memories of their childhoods, from philosophy to the simple pleasure of watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Tabitha learned that Ethan had been a sharpshooter during the war, that he had nightmares sometimes that he refused to discuss, that his favorite season was autumn when the aspens turned gold. She learned that he could track a deer through country that looked barren to her untrained eyes, that he had traded with the Lakota and respected their ways, that he carved small wooden animals during the long winter nights and left them as gifts for the rare travelers who passed through his territory. And Ethan learned about Tabitha, about the fever that had taken her parents, about her love of stories and her dreams of having a family of her own someday. He learned that she was stronger than she looked, that she had a quick wit and a stubborn streak, that she sang quietly to herself while she worked and had a smile that could light up his dim cabin like sunshine. On the 5th day, they were working side by side in the garden when Ethan suddenly went still, his head cocked in a listening attitude. Someone is coming, he said quietly, urgency in his tone. Get in the cabin and stay away from the windows. Tabitha's heart leaped into her throat. The bandits? Maybe, Ethan said, his hand going to the knife at his belt. Do as I say, Tabitha, now. She hurried into the cabin, her pulse racing, and positioned herself where she could see out through a gap in the shutters. Ethan stood in the clearing, appearing relaxed but ready, as a rider emerged from the trail. To Tabitha's surprise, the newcomer was not one of Garrett's gang, but rather a well-dressed man on a fine chestnut mare. He was perhaps 40 years old, with thinning brown hair and a neatly trimmed beard, wearing clothes that marked him as a man of some wealth. "Hello, the cabin," the man called out, raising one hand to show he was unarmed. "I'm looking for Ethan Carver." "You found him," Ethan replied, not moving from his position. "State your business." "My name is William Frost," the man said, and Tabitha's breath caught. Her intended husband, here at Ethan's cabin? "I am looking for a woman, Miss Tabitha Morgan. I received a ransom demand for her, and I have been searching ever since. A trapper told me Carver might know something about the bandits who took her." Ethan was silent for a long moment. Tabitha watched, her emotions in turmoil. William Frost had come looking for her. He had not simply paid or refused the ransom, he had come himself to search for her. That spoke of a certain character, surely. "She is here," Ethan finally said. "She is safe." Relief flooded William Frost's face. "Thank God. May I see her?" Ethan glanced toward the cabin, and Tabitha took that as her cue. She stepped outside, smoothing her skirt nervously. William Frost dismounted immediately, striding toward her with obvious concern. "Miss Morgan, I cannot tell you how worried I have been," he said earnestly, stopping a respectful distance away. "Are you hurt? Did those animals harm you?" "No, I'm unharmed," Tabitha assured him, studying the man who was supposed to be her husband. He had a kind face, she noted, and genuine worry in his eyes. "Mr. Carver rescued me and has been keeping me safe." William turned to Ethan, extending his hand. "Then I owe you a debt I can never repay, sir. Name your price." Ethan looked at the offered hand for a moment, then shook it briefly. "No price. I did what needed doing. Nevertheless, I insist on compensating you for your trouble and for caring for my fiancé, William persisted. He pulled a leather purse from his jacket. Please, at least allow me to— No, Ethan said flatly, his expression hardening. I said no price. The lady is free to go with you if that is what she wants. All eyes turned to Tabitha. She felt frozen, caught between two very different futures. William Frost represented everything she had come west to find: security, respectability, a proper home and family. But Ethan, rough mountain man that he was, represented something she had not known she was searching for, something that made her heart race and her skin feel too warm. She began, then faltered. Mr. Frost, I appreciate you coming to search for me. Truly I do. But I find myself in need of more time before I can commit to marriage. The kidnapping, the fear, it has left me shaken. William's face fell slightly, but he nodded understanding. Of course, I completely understand. Would you like me to take you to a hotel in Lincoln? You can have all the time you need to recover. Actually, Tabitha heard herself say, surprising even herself, I would like to stay here a bit longer if Ethan does not mind. I find the peace of the mountains to be healing. Ethan's expression was unreadable, but he gave a single nod. She's welcome as long as she wants to stay. William looked between them, and something flickered in his eyes, understanding perhaps, or disappointment. I see, he said slowly. Well, Miss Morgan, I want you to know that my offer of marriage stands. When you are ready, if you are ever ready, you need only send word. I will be waiting. Thank you, Mr. Frost, Tabitha said softly. You're very kind. He mounted his horse, pausing to give Ethan a long look. Take care of her, Carver. She's a special woman. I know, Ethan replied, his voice gruff. They watched William Frost ride back down the trail until he disappeared from sight. Then they were alone again, the silence between them charged with unspoken things. You did not have to stay, Ethan finally said, not looking at her. He's a good man from what I hear. Wealthy, respectable. He could give you everything you came west to find. I know, Tabitha said, echoing his earlier words. She took a breath, gathering her courage. But he is not what I want, Ethan. He turned to her then, and the intensity in those pale blue eyes nearly stole her breath. What do you want, Tabitha? I want, she said slowly, stepping closer to him, to stay here, with you, if you will have me. You do not know what you are saying, Ethan said, but there was longing in his voice that betrayed him. This is a hard life, Tabitha, isolated, rough. You deserve better than— Do not tell me what I deserve, Tabitha interrupted, closing the distance between them until she stood directly in front of him. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. I have spent the last 5 years being told what I should want, what I should do. For once in my life, I want to choose for myself. And I choose this. I choose you, if you want me. Want you? Ethan's voice was hoarse. His hands came up to frame her face, calloused palms gentle against her skin. God help me, Tabitha. I have wanted you since the moment I saw you in that cabin, scared but defiant. But you deserve someone better than a broken mountain man with blood on his hands and nightmares in his head. You are not broken, Tabitha said fiercely, covering his hands with hers. You are the strongest, kindest, most honorable man I have ever met, and I am falling in love with you, Ethan Carver. His breath caught, and for a moment he just stared at her. Then, with a sound that was half groan, half sigh, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss, not tentative or polite. It was desperate and hungry, full of days of restrained longing and denied desire. Tabitha kissed him back with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck, her fingers tangling in his long hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said roughly. I did not think I could feel this way again, did not want to. But God, Tabitha, I love you so much it terrifies me. Do not be afraid, she whispered, tears of joy slipping down her cheeks. We will figure this out together. He kissed her again, softer this time, tender and full of promise, and Tabitha knew with absolute certainty that this was right. This was what she had crossed half a continent to find, not a wealthy rancher with polite letters, but this fierce, gentle mountain man who had carried her out of darkness and into light. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Tabitha's life. She and Ethan fell into their life together with an ease that felt like coming home. She officially became his wife in a simple ceremony performed by a traveling preacher who passed through on his circuit with a Lakota family Ethan traded with serving as witnesses. There was no white dress or fancy reception, just heartfelt vows spoken under the vast Montana sky, with the mountains as their cathedral. Ethan proved to be a devoted husband, attentive and loving in ways that constantly surprised her. He brought her wildflowers from the high meadows, taught her to track and hunt, held her through the occasional nightmare she still had about her captivity. She, in turn, brought warmth and light into his solitary existence, filling the cabin with laughter and song, tending their home with care, and loving him with a fierceness that matched his own. They made love slowly and thoroughly that first night as husband and wife, learning each other's bodies by firelight. And Tabitha discovered that beneath Ethan's rough exterior was a tender, passionate man who worshipped her with his hands and mouth and body. He was gentle despite his strength, patient with her inexperience, and the pleasure he brought her was beyond anything she had imagined. As autumn deepened into winter, they prepared for the cold months ahead. Ethan hunted deer and elk, smoking and storing the meat, while Tabitha preserved vegetables from the garden and gathered wild berries. They worked side by side, chopping wood, checking traps, fortifying the cabin against the coming snows. And in the evenings, they sat by the fire, reading aloud to each other or simply talking, content in each other's presence. It was in late November, as the first serious snow began to fall, that Ethan brought up the subject of Garrett and the other bandits. They were sitting by the fire after dinner, Tabitha's head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "I need to finish what I started," he said quietly. "Garrett is still out there, still hurting people. I cannot let that stand." Tabitha's heart clenched with fear, but she had known this conversation was coming. "What will you do?" "The territorial marshal is in Lincoln," Ethan said. "I have information on Garrett's hideouts, his patterns. I can help them track him down, bring him to justice properly." "Then I will come with you," Tabitha said immediately. "Tabitha." "No," she said firmly, sitting up to look at him. "We are partners, Ethan. I will not sit here worrying while you are in danger. Besides, I can identify all of the men in that gang. My testimony could help ensure they hang." Ethan looked like he wanted to argue, but he could see the determination in her eyes. Finally, he sighed. "You are the stubbornest woman I have ever met." "And you love me for it," Tabitha said, kissing him softly. "Yes," he agreed, pulling her close. "God help me, I do." They made the journey to Lincoln in early December, before the worst of the winter storms could trap them in the mountains. It was strange for Tabitha to return to the town where her western adventure had begun so disastrously. The marshal, a grizzled veteran named Tom Hendricks, listened intently to their story and gratefully accepted Ethan's help. It took another month of careful tracking and planning, but eventually, Garrett and his gang were cornered in their canyon hideout. There was a brief violent confrontation. Garrett drew on the marshal's deputies, and in the resulting gunfight, he and two of his men were killed. The others, including Pike and Silas, were captured and subsequently tried for their crimes. Tabitha testified at the trial, facing down the men who had terrorized her, and felt a deep satisfaction when the judge sentenced them to hang. Through it all, Ethan was by her side, his steady presence giving her strength. And when it was finally over, when justice had been served and the threat eliminated, they returned to their mountain cabin with light hearts. Winter passed in a cocoon of warmth and love. Tabitha taught Ethan to appreciate the finer points of literature, reading him passages from her favorite novels while he carved or worked on maintaining their equipment. He taught her to shoot, patiently correcting her stance and aim until she could hit a target with reasonable accuracy. They made love by firelight and talked for hours about their dreams and hopes for the future. It was in February that Tabitha realized she was with child. She had suspected for a few weeks, but when she was finally certain, she waited for the perfect moment to tell Ethan. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "I have something to tell you," she said softly. Ethan looked at her, his expression questioning. Then, understanding dawned and his eyes widened. "Tabitha, are you?" "Yes," she said, her smile radiant. "We are going to have a baby, Ethan. You are going to be a father." For a moment he seemed unable to speak. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. When he finally released her enough to see his face, she was shocked to see tears on his cheeks. "I never thought," he said hoarsely. "I never let myself hope for something like this, a family of my own." "We are a family," Tabitha said, her own tears flowing freely. "You, me, and this little one. Our family, Ethan." He kissed her then, tender and reverent, and Tabitha felt complete in a way she had never experienced before. This was what she had been searching for all along, not wealth or security, but love and belonging and the promise of a future built together. The months of Tabitha's pregnancy passed with surprising speed. Spring came to the mountains, bringing wildflowers and new growth, and Tabitha's belly swelled with their growing child. Ethan was attentive to the point of hovering, constantly checking on her welfare, insisting she rest more, worry less. She found his concern endearing, even when it bordered on excessive. In late May, they made the journey down to Lincoln so Tabitha could be near a doctor for the birth. Ethan had wanted to stay in the mountains where he felt more comfortable, but Tabitha had insisted on this precaution, and he had reluctantly agreed. They took rooms in a small but respectable boarding house run by a kindly widow named Mrs. Patterson, and Ethan found work at the livery to pay their way. It was while they were in town that they encountered William Frost again. The rancher was in Lincoln on business, and he spotted them walking along the main street, Tabitha's advanced pregnancy obvious. He approached with a smile that seemed genuine, tipping his hat respectfully. "Mr. and Mrs. Carver," he greeted them warmly. "How wonderful to see you both." "Mr. Frost," Tabitha replied, genuinely pleased to see him looking well. "How have you been?" "Well enough," William said, his gaze dropping briefly to her rounded belly. "I can see that congratulations are in order." "Thank you," Ethan said, his arm tightening protectively around Tabitha's waist. There was no hostility in his tone, but there was wariness. William seemed to sense this and hastened to reassure him. "I want you both to know that I harbor no ill will. In fact, I recently became engaged myself to a lovely schoolteacher from Omaha. Sometimes things work out the way they are meant to, even if it is not the way we originally planned." Relief and happiness flooded through Tabitha. "Oh, William, that is wonderful news. I'm so happy for you." They talked for a few more minutes, the conversation easy and friendly, and when they parted ways, Tabitha felt like a chapter had finally closed. William Frost had been part of her journey west, but Ethan Carver was her destination, her home, her everything. Their son was born on a hot June evening, after a long labor that left Tabitha exhausted but elated. Ethan had refused to leave her side despite the doctor's protestations about propriety, holding her hand through every contraction, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement. And when the baby finally entered the world, squalling and red-faced, Ethan cut the cord with steady hands and placed their son on Tabitha's chest with a reverence that made her heart overflow. "He is perfect," she whispered, gazing down at the tiny, wrinkled face. "Absolutely perfect." "He is a miracle," Ethan agreed, his voice thick with emotion. He gently stroked the baby's downy head with one calloused finger. "What should we name him?" Tabitha looked up at her husband, at the tears streaming unashamedly down his bearded face, at the wonder and love in his eyes. "Thomas," she said softly. "After your brother. Thomas Carver." Ethan closed his eyes, overcome, and bent to kiss her forehead. "Thank you," he whispered, "for this, for everything. I love you so much, Tabitha." "I love you too," she replied, cradling their son close. "More than words can say." They spent another month in Lincoln, allowing Tabitha to recover her strength and baby Thomas to grow a bit before making the journey back to the mountains. Ethan's brother, also named Thomas, came up from Denver to meet his nephew and namesake, and the reunion between the two brothers was emotional and healing. The elder Thomas was walking with a cane now, his leg healed but never quite right, but he seemed at peace with his new life running a small mercantile in the city. "You found yourself a good one," Thomas told Ethan one evening, watching Tabitha rock the baby by the fire in the boarding house parlor. "She loves you fierce, anyone can see that." "I know," Ethan replied quietly. "I still wake up some mornings thinking it's all a dream, that I will open my eyes and be back in that empty cabin, alone." "Not a dream, little brother," Thomas said, clapping him on the shoulder. You deserve this happiness. You have always been the best of us, even when you could not see it yourself." When they finally returned to their mountain home in late July, it was with full hearts and a sense of rightness. The cabin felt different now, warmer somehow, filled with the sounds of a baby's cries and coos, of lullabies sung softly in the evening. Ethan proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle with his son, able to soothe him when even Tabitha struggled. She would often find him sitting by the window in the early morning light, Thomas cradled against his broad chest, talking to the baby in that low, rumbling voice about the mountains, the animals, the beauty of the world they lived in. The years flowed by like the creek outside their cabin, steady and constant. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious toddler, then a bright boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to track and hunt and live off the land. When he was 3, Tabitha gave birth to twin girls, Emma and Sarah, who filled the cabin with even more laughter and chaos. Ethan built an addition onto the cabin to accommodate their growing family, and Tabitha sewed clothes and grew vegetables and somehow managed to keep everyone fed, clean, and loved. They were not wealthy by any measure. Some winters were harder than others, times when game was scarce and supplies ran low. But they always managed, working together, supporting each other through every challenge. And through it all, their love never wavered. If anything, it grew stronger, deeper, tempered by shared experiences and mutual respect. When Thomas was 10 and the twins were 7, Tabitha discovered she was pregnant again. This 4th pregnancy was harder than the others, and both she and Ethan worried. But in the spring, she delivered a healthy baby boy they named James, and the cabin once again rang with the sounds of a newborn. Ethan was nearing 50 now, his dark hair liberally streaked with silver, his beard almost fully gray. But he was still strong, still capable, and he loved Tabitha with the same fierce devotion he had shown that night he carried her out of the bandit camp so many years before. She had aged as well, fine lines around her eyes and mouth, her once dark hair showing threads of white. But to Ethan, she was as beautiful as the day he first saw her, and he told her so often. Sometimes, in the quiet moments after the children were asleep, they would sit together by the fire and remember how they had found each other. They would talk about the strange path that had led a kidnapped mail-order bride and a solitary mountain man to build a life together in the wilderness. And they would marvel at how something that began with violence and fear had transformed into a love story for the ages. As the years continued to pass, their children grew and thrived. Thomas proved to have his father's skill with tracking and hunting, along with his mother's love of learning. The twins were inseparable, wild and free like the mountain wind, equally comfortable with a rifle or a book. And young James showed signs of being the most thoughtful of them all, with a gift for understanding animals and nature. When Thomas turned 18, he announced his intention to try his hand at ranching, having saved money from trapping and trading. Ethan and Tabitha helped him purchase a small piece of land in the valley below their mountain home, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough for him to establish his independence. Within 2 years, he had married a girl from Lincoln, a pretty blonde named Rachel, and they were expecting their first child. The twins, always knowing their own minds, decided on different paths. Emma had a gift for healing and went to study with the doctor in Lincoln, while Sarah fell in love with a trapper named Daniel and moved with him to Montana. They all stayed close, though, visiting often and remaining the tight-knit family Ethan and Tabitha had worked so hard to build. James, the youngest, showed no interest in leaving the mountains. He was content to stay with his parents, helping his aging father with the heavy work, learning everything Ethan could teach him. Tabitha sometimes worried that he was sacrificing his own future to care for them, but James always insisted he was exactly where he wanted to be. It was a crisp autumn morning, the aspens turning gold and the air sharp with the promise of winter, when Ethan took a bad fall while checking his trap lines. James found him and got him back to the cabin, but Ethan had broken his leg badly. The doctor came up from Lincoln and did what he could, but everyone knew Ethan would never again roam the mountains with his former ease. Tabitha nursed him through the long recovery, just as he had once cared for her through her pregnancies and illnesses. She read to him from their beloved books, cooked his favorite meals, and sat with him by the window so he could still see the wilderness he loved. And when he despaired at his limitations, she reminded him of all he had accomplished, all the lives he had touched and shaped. "You carried me out of darkness," she told him one evening, holding his weathered hand in hers. "You gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams, 4 beautiful children, a home filled with love, adventures I never could have imagined. You have nothing to prove, my love, nothing at all." Ethan gazed at her, his pale blue eyes still as sharp as ever, despite his body's failing. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Tabitha Morgan Carver, the absolute best thing." "And you to me," she replied, leaning in to kiss him softly. "Today, tomorrow, and always." More years passed. Grandchildren came, filling the cabin with new energy during visits. Thomas had 3 boys and a girl. Emma married the new doctor in Lincoln and had twin sons. Sarah had 4 children in quick succession, though she swore each one would be her last. Even James eventually married, a quiet Lakota woman named Laughing Water, who fit into the family as if she had always been there. Ethan's leg healed, but he walked with a limp now, relying on a cane his son had carved for him. He could no longer trap or hunt the way he once had, but he found new purpose in teaching his grandchildren, passing on the knowledge and skills that had sustained him through decades in the wilderness. And he spent long hours with Tabitha, cherishing every moment they had together. They were both in their 70s when Ethan finally admitted he was tired. It was winter, the snow deep and the wind howling outside, and they were sitting by the fire as they had done thousands of times before. Tabitha looked at him and saw the weariness in his eyes, the way his breathing had become labored, and she knew. "Not yet," she whispered, moving to sit beside him, taking his hand. "Please, not yet." "I will fight it as long as I can," Ethan promised, bringing her hand to his lips. "But when the time comes, Tabitha, you have to let me go. Promise me you will live, really live, for whatever time you have left." "I promise," she said, though the words nearly choked her. "But you have to promise me something too. Promise that when you go, you will wait for me. Wherever we end up, promise you will be there, waiting." "Always," Ethan said fiercely, pulling her close. "In this life and the next, Tabitha. I will always find you." He held on through that winter and into the spring, determined to see one more season of wildflowers in the high meadows. James and Laughing Water moved into the cabin to help care for him, and the other children visited as often as they could. Thomas came with his whole family. Emma closed her practice to spend 2 weeks with them, and Sarah made the long journey from Montana with her brood. On a perfect May morning, with the cabin full of family and the windows open to let in the scent of pine and wildflowers, Ethan Carver closed his eyes for the last time. Tabitha was beside him, holding his hand, whispering words of love, and when he took his final breath, she felt as though part of her soul went with him. The grief was overwhelming at first, a physical pain that stole her breath and made her question how she could possibly go on. But she had promised Ethan she would live, and she was not one to break her promises. So she leaned on her children, found solace in her grandchildren, and slowly, the sharp edges of loss softened into a bittersweet ache. She stayed in the cabin, refusing all offers to move down to Lincoln or to live with one of her children. This was her home, where she had loved and been loved, where she had raised her babies and grown old with the man of her dreams. James and Laughing Water lived there with her, along with their 2 young sons, and the cabin remained a place of warmth and welcome. Tabitha lived for another 5 years, long enough to see 2 more great-grandchildren born, long enough to teach her granddaughters everything she knew about cooking and sewing and surviving in the mountains. She remained sharp and engaged until the very end, still reading voraciously, still telling stories of the old days, still speaking of Ethan with a love that brought tears to everyone's eyes. She died peacefully in her sleep one autumn night, with the aspens gold outside her window and the sound of the creek she loved bubbling over stones. James found her in the morning, lying in the bed she had shared with Ethan for so many years, a slight smile on her face, as though she had seen something wonderful. They buried her beside Ethan on the hillside overlooking the valley, under the spreading boughs of an ancient pine. The entire family gathered for the funeral, 3 generations of Carvers, all of them descended from a mountain man and a stagecoach bride who had found each other against impossible odds. Thomas, now an old man himself with grandchildren of his own, stood at the graveside and told the story his mother had shared so many times. He told of bandits and ransoms, of a daring midnight rescue, of two people who fell in love in a mountain cabin and built a legacy that would endure for generations. He told of courage and devotion, of hardship overcome and joy embraced, of a love that transcended time and circumstance. And as the family stood together on that hillside, united by the bonds that Ethan and Tabitha had forged, they knew that this was not an ending, but a continuation. The love story that began on a dusty Nebraska trail in 1876 would live on in every child and grandchild, in the values they had been taught, in the strength and kindness that had been modeled for them. Ethan and Tabitha Carver had lived an extraordinary life in ordinary circumstances. They had found each other in the darkness and built something beautiful in the light. They had loved fiercely and completely, without reservation or regret. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy anyone could hope to leave behind, not wealth or fame or worldly success, but love that echoed through the generations, touching hearts and changing lives long after the lovers themselves had gone. In the years that followed, the Carver family continued to thrive. The cabin in the mountains became a gathering place, a touchstone for a family that had spread across the West but never forgot its roots. Children and grandchildren would make pilgrimages to the hillside graves, leaving wildflowers and telling their own children the story of the mountain man and the stagecoach bride. The tale became a family legend, embellished slightly with each retelling, but always maintaining its essential truth that love could be found in the most unexpected places, that courage came in many forms, and that the choices we make in moments of crisis can shape not just our own lives, but the lives of generations to come. Thomas's eldest grandson eventually wrote down the story, compiling it from family letters, his grandfather's memories, and his own imagination. It became a small book that circulated among the family, a treasure passed down from parent to child, a reminder of where they came from and the love that had made them possible. And sometimes, locals claimed, on quiet mountain nights when the moon was full and the aspens whispered in the breeze, you could see two figures walking hand in hand through the high meadows, a tall, broad-shouldered man with long silver hair, and a woman whose laughter carried on the wind like music. Whether it was ghost or legend or simply the wishful thinking of romantics, no one could say. But the story persisted, adding another layer to the tale of Ethan and Tabitha Carver, the mountain man and his rescued bride who had loved each other across a lifetime and beyond. The land itself seemed to remember them. The cabin, maintained lovingly by successive generations, stood for more than a century before finally succumbing to time and weather. But even in its ruin, it remained a sacred place, a monument to enduring love. The creek still bubbled over its stones, the pine still spread its branches over the hillside graves, and the wildflowers still bloomed each spring in riotous profusion, as though nature itself was honoring the memory of two people who had lived in harmony with the wilderness. And so the story ends where it began, in the wild beauty of the American West, in a time when life was hard but love was strong, when a woman could be kidnapped from a stagecoach and rescued by a mountain man, and when that terrifying beginning could transform into a love story that would echo through time. Ethan and Tabitha Carver had faced darkness and chosen light, had known fear and chosen courage, had been offered many paths and chosen each other. Their story was complete, their circle closed, their love eternal. They had lived fully, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy that would never fade. From the moment Ethan had carried Tabitha out of that bandit camp under cover of darkness to the moment they were reunited in whatever lies beyond this life, their journey had been extraordinary. And though their physical presence was gone from the world, their spirit remained in the mountains they loved, in the family they created, in the enduring truth that true love, once found, never truly dies. The sun set over the mountains one last time, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, just as it had done for millions of years before, and would do for millions more. And somewhere, somehow, two souls walked together in that eternal light, their journey finally complete, their love story finally told, their happily ever after fully realized at last.